This week's scripture is taken from the book of Ezekiel, reading from chapter 37, verses 1 to 14. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord, and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, O sovereign Lord, you alone know. Then he said to me, Prophesy to these bones and say to them, Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you, and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life, and then you will know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I was prophesying there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of man, and say to it, This is what the sovereign Lord says. Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them, and they came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone, we are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, This is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. Thanks be to God for his word.
This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice in it. Today we are brought to the word of the Lord in Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 to 14. It was the worst day of her life. She came home to find him gone. She didn't understand. She thought they'd worked things out. She thought things were going better and the rough patch was over. But he was gone. No warning, no note, nothing. She had given him 15 years of her life, given him everything, her love, her devotion. She had given up her dearest and most precious dream for him, that she would one day have children. And now he was gone. She was 42 years old, and his new girlfriend was pregnant. It was the worst day of her life. Her family and her friends gathered around her and gave her support, care, and love. She threw herself into her work, and she found that when she was working at her computer, strangely, she didn't feel that same stress that she used to feel. At the end of the day, what would she come home to? What fight would they have that night? She looked up some of her old friends and got connected with them again. She joined compatible groups, things she was interested in, met all kinds of interesting people, took trips, and then an amazing thing happened. She met someone and they married. And she found herself with a whole new cohort of family and friends who actually had her true interests at heart. And they had a wonderful and rich marriage until something even more amazing happened. And she became pregnant and gave birth to two healthy twin girls. Can you imagine how loved those little babies were? It was the worst day of Israel's life. In fact, there was no more Israel. It had become nothing but a desert floor littered with the dry bones of its slaughtered warriors who had been defeated. Think of those pictures you've seen of the World War I battlefields, horrible things. Dead bodies by the thousands, so many, there hadn't even been survivors enough to bury them. The prophet Ezekiel saw this in a vision that God gave him. And he was seeing in that vision the inevitable outcome of Israel's devastating defeat when the mighty Babylonian army wiped out the total Israelites army. Israel had never had a chance. Babylon was the greatest, mightiest empire of its time, and Israel, well, they were just a tiny nation hemmed in by other empires, led by a failing monarchy and a corrupt leadership and people who'd forgotten God. God had warned them over and over not to go to war with nations that were mightier than they were. But they didn't listen. They didn't listen because they were so convinced that God was on their side. And with God on their side, they couldn't possibly lose, even though God kept saying to them, trust in the Lord. Do not trust in war. But no one would listen to the prophets. You know how it is when a nation is pumped up for war. There's constant enthusiasm for it and support for it, and anyone opposing it is a traitor. Well, they went to war. They got wiped out. It was the worst year, the worst decade, the worst day of Israel's life. And here's what was left of the mighty Israelite army: bones sprawled out on the desert sands. As far as the eye could see, the Lord took Ezekiel and showed him all around this field. Back in Jerusalem, it had been even worse because the Babylonians had put the city under siege and people had starved to the point that their very humanity was at stake. And then one day they broke through the walls and everything was destroyed. The temple was destroyed, the priests slaughtered at the altar where they were offering the sacrifices, the palaces, the courtyards, the markets, the streets, children, women, men, everyone destroyed. There was nothing left. And the leaders either executed or led away in chains to Babylon, to this strange foreign land. No wonder the people said, God can't help us. God won't help us. God has left us alone. We have become like dry bones. But in that place, far away in exile, even before, there had been two exiles, and during the first one, the prophet Ezekiel had been living among the exiles. And this one man, called by God, a priest who became a prophet, had this vision that God had given him that we're reading about today, taking Ezekiel to this death valley. And as the Lord stood with Ezekiel and they surveyed this desolate site, the Lord said to Ezekiel, "Shall these bones live again?" And Ezekiel said, of course he said, "I don't know, Lord, only you know." And then God spoke, and what God said was captured in that old spiritual that James Weldon Johnson, the famous writer and activist and scholar who wrote the Black National Anthem, Lift Up Every Voice and Sing, a Black activist for his people before such words were even thought of. He's the one, if you didn't know, who wrote that spiritual that we used to sing a lot. You may remember it, dem bones, gonna walk around, heel bone connected, all that. Dem bones gonna walk around again. He was speaking to his own people, of course, just as Ezekiel and God was speaking to the nation of Israel. And one day, the nation of Israel, represented by that field of dry bones, did walk again. It did rise again. The temple was rebuilt. The walls were rebuilt. The nation was rebuilt. And that mighty empire of Babylon that had seemed so powerful it would never end only lasted 50 years more. And it was defeated then by Persia. And God, during this time of exile, when the people were trying to make sense of it all, God made a promise to the people. God said, "One day I will pour out my spirit, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams, and your sons and daughters will prophesy, and I will send my spirit into you. You will breathe my breath. You will see with my eyes. You will come home. You will come home to this land that I gave you, the land you lost because you forgot that I, the Lord God, who created you, love you the most. One day, these bones will be a living nation again." because I will forgive you. I will forgive you what you brought down upon yourselves. I will forgive you all of this death and destruction. I will forgive you, and I will raise you up to new life. The day Jesus was crucified was the worst day of his disciples' life. And even though they came to understand that he had indeed been raised from the dead, even though they knew that first joyous confusion, they were still unclear. What now? What was going to happen now? They were uncertain of the way forward. There were no models. There were no patterns. This was unheard of. This was nothing that had ever happened in their knowledge or history, and so they didn't know what to do. And somewhere in their understanding of what was going to happen next, if Jesus had been raised from the dead, maybe their dream was going to happen after all. You know, that dream that they were going to restore the great monarchy of King David, and with the temple and the palaces and the walls, and they would be the ones in charge then, and everything would be right because they would have a just and a good ruler of their nation. Israel will be mighty again. And so there was a sense, I have no doubt, that during this waiting time, when they were waiting for instructions, they were still locked in time and confusion about what would come next. Be in their shoes a moment. I mean, once this little community had been so um, excited, they had so much momentum and power and promise as they followed Jesus, and they saw all the miracles he performed, miracles that declared that he was the Messiah. The lame walked, and the blind saw, and the deaf heard. And they walked the roads together, full of enthusiasm and joy and hope as they reviewed each day's events. They were going to take the world by storm. And when they wondered, when are we going to go to Jerusalem? And when they did go with their palm branches and hosannas and their Messiah parade into Jerusalem, their hearts sang. They understood that it was happening. It was happening. Everything they waited for had been happening. And before they could catch their breath, from this moment of triumph, suddenly Jesus was hung on the cross, a dead thing, no longer their beloved teacher and master, the one they followed. He would be just more dead bones. And even when he was raised from the dead, even when they believed it, they would still have trouble recovering. They were a traumatized community. You do not recover from trauma overnight. Some people never recover. This trauma they had experienced was horrendous, just as Israel's trauma had been. But they had something that ancient Israel didn't have. They had each other, and they had a growing, stirring hope because Jesus was alive. It's all there in a way in Ezekiel's vision, because the cry of Israel did not just come from the dead bones in the field. And here's where we need to focus a bit. It came from the survivors. This cry, "We are cut off," did not come from the dead bones of the field. It came from the people far away. Because remember, Ezekiel was carried from his place of exile to this place in Israel, the battlefield. It came from the survivors of the catastrophe, the exiles, those who were cut off from a home that is no longer there. I always remember once the stupidest question. You know, ask questions with good intentions. And I remember we were having a special event with the Somalian Christian community of refugees in Toronto. And they put on a dinner, and we went to the dinner. And there was a beautiful young Somali woman who was helping organize it. And we were hosting it. And I asked her, a really stupid question. I said, "Do you miss your home village?" And she just looked at me a moment and she said, "My home village is gone. It's not there. There's no home village." It was like that for the people far away. Ezekiel was writing from the foreign country where he and his people were being held as exiles, first as captives, and then they settled in a community and became exiles. So the cry of anguish from the bones came not from the dead soldiers, but from these exiles far away. those who had been led in chains, whose homes were gone forever, it seemed. Because, see, they couldn't believe that God, whose home was in the temple, surely could possibly go with them into a strange country. And so they say, our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. The dire situation of God's people, the worst day of Israel's life, that dire situation, you see, was not just about death and destruction, though there was lots and lots of that. It was about losing hope. It was about being isolated and separated from God, from homeland, from worship, from neighbor, from everything that made them a people in their lives. And Ezekiel was writing after a disaster that had been bad enough, and yet as he kept trying to warn them, this final catastrophe he foresaw would be coming. People would one day have to make sense of the complete and utter loss and destruction of everything that was sacred to them and holy and that they thought was permanent. God reminded them, though, that though they had broken the covenant, God would never abandon them. And that's what today's passage is about. They could be forgiven. They could start over. They could have a new life. They could have each other. Here's the thing. It strikes me, just maybe because we're all dealing with isolation right now, but in Ezekiel's vision, the first thing that happens is that when he prophesies, there's this great noise. There's a shaking and a rattling that seems to almost shake the earth. And that noise is the bones finding each other. It says the bones came together, bone to its bone. Ezekiel's prophecy was to assure the broken people of Israel who were imprisoned far from home that they could find one another again. They could find their rightful place, and God would breathe new life into them, and they'd come home. Johnson's spiritual Dem Bones zeroes in on a key part of Ezekiel's vision. Johnson understood as he wrote this what the prophecy was trying to say. That in that dramatic moment when the bones find one another, that rattling, shaking moment, and our music this week that I'm sending you has that same centerpiece. The sound is the bones finding each other, and as they find each other, they find where they fit, they find where they belong, they find their rightful place. It's what the lyrics are saying, you know. It says Ezekiel connected them dry bones. You know, the toe bone connected to the heel bone connected to the foot bone to the ankle bone, and they're connected to the place where they belong. Now hear the word of the Lord. The word of the Lord is, I will put you where you belong. And then came the sinews and the flesh, but still they were not alive because there was no breath. And so at God's command, Ezekiel called forth the breath, and the breath came into the people, and they lived, and they stood on their feet, a great multitude. And there we leave them. There we leave them in today's story. That's the end of the vision. I love that part. That's the end of the vision. The great multitude rises up, the bones find each other, sinews, flesh, and then breath. And they stand there, this great multitude, waiting. Just as Israel waited in exile, just as those first believers in an upper room after Jesus rose waited, alive, ready, but waiting. And maybe just as we right now, alive, wait. Our bones are dried up, they said, and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. It's not only being dried up that kills us, that's hard on us, it's losing hope. And one of the ways that human beings lose hope is when they are separated and isolated from other human beings. We were made to be together. We belong together. And we are all feeling something of that sense of being cut off. And that does tend to block hope. So be careful of that in these few weeks while we're waiting. As we are waiting, it's very hard to be separated from our loved ones and neighbors and community and from activity, from the things that we do together, from worship, from all the things that matter to us. But there's Ezekiel's vision, which is Ezekiel's vision is God's promise. It's God's promise ever and always to all of us when we have these times of feeling dried up and cut off. God is going to bring something next. Next Sunday is the Sunday of Pentecost, which is the birthday of the church, when God's Spirit rushed in fire and wind and breath to bring life and courage and power to those disciples in that room where they waited. And as the story of the work of God's Spirit in their lives and in their journey and in their mission goes forth, we'll see that we never know how God is going to work in our lives. We can't predict it. What we do know is that God will never stop working to bring us together and to reweave the broken strands of our lives, to breathe new life into dreams we thought we were dead, and to give us a vision of our better selves. You know, we might lose everything and find that after all, we have everything. We never know. But on the worst days of our lives, the worst times, we can be as dry as a dead bone and cut off from everyone. Those worst times, we can find that just when it seems most hopeless, we turn a corner and we're looking right into the light of a brilliant new tomorrow that God has prepared for us. We're all standing there waiting. Trust in the Lord. The day is coming. Amen.